On the 1st of September, 1939, Germany unleashed the great technological advances of the 20th century in a withering attack on neighboring Poland. What followed was the most devastating conflict in human history, as men and women from virtually every nation on Earth engaged in the bitter struggle that was World War II. For 6 long years, the fate of our world rose and fell, delicately poised on a knife edge of key events, victories and losses, mistakes and heroics. This is the story of that knife edge. The turning points that shaped mankind's greatest watershed, taking both sides within sight of victory. While Hitler's invasion of Poland had indeed created a crisis, it was, at first, a purely continental one, confined to Eastern Europe. Britain and France declared war on Germany, but the absence of decisive action, combined with a deep distrust of Hitler's Germany, emboldened some nations while forcing the hands of others. But when Germany struck again, the war would quickly spread throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, and for a moment, it was only Britain that stood between Hitler and total domination. Russia surprised the Allies by signing a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in August 1939. That agreement, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, had been vital in assuring that Hitler could invade Poland without fear of Soviet interference.
The most important factor in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is the so-called secret clause. This gives Stalin control, together with Hitler, of Eastern Europe.
But the speed with which the German army overran the Poles in September caused serious concern in Moscow. And with a border only 30 kilometers from Leningrad, Stalin decided that neutral Finland would provide the buffer he needed against potential invasion in the north.
Finland had been part of the Russian Empire, and Stalin's Soviet Union thought that it had dibs on Finland, and in the winter of 1939-40 invaded Finland, hoping to snatch some easy territory. It didn't turn out that way, though.
Russian territorial claims on Finland had intensified throughout 1939, and the Finns, under the instruction of their revered Civil War hero, Field Marshal Karl Mannerheim, responded by building a complex series of entrenched defenses through the only area where the local geography would allow Russia to invade, the Karelian Isthmus. On the 30th of November, that invasion began with the surprise bombing of the capital, Helsinki, before 450,000 men and over 4,000 tanks crossed the border. A staggering show of force, 3 times greater than that of the Allied landings on D-Day. The entire Finnish army comprised just 70,000 men, very few anti-tank weapons, and just 34 World War I-era tanks, of which anecdotal reports suggest only 1 was operational. The Finns were slowly pushed back as calls for assistance went largely ignored by an international community who seemed of the opinion that Finland was a lost cause. But then the weather turned, and Finland began to experience one of its coldest winters on record. And as temperatures plunged below -40, more and more Soviet soldiers began to succumb to the cold. And it wasn't just the men who froze. In the depths of winter, on rugged, unmade tracks in the Finnish countryside, the Russian motorized columns ground to a halt. And the Finns, clad in white winter combat suits making them almost impossible to detect, wreaked havoc.
The Finns, who were very lightly equipped and moved on skis, descended on the Russian columns, cut them off and cut them to pieces, a tactic that the Finns called moti, which means piling up wood in the forests.
But perhaps the greatest handicap the Russians faced was leadership.
I think we have to remember that the Russian army before this war had been massively purged by Stalin. So every senior officer knew that if he failed, he would literally be executed.
It makes commanders very reluctant to take initiative. It really does damage the Soviet war effort.
On the 13th of March, the Finnish and Russian governments agreed to an armistice. Those 3 cold months had cost the lives of over 200,000 Russian soldiers. When a Russian soldier was asked after World War II what he remembered of the Winter War, he said simply, "The incompetence of our army." An observation not lost on the rest of Europe, particularly Adolf Hitler. Far from the border conflicts of Russia and Finland, German naval vessels had been ordered to shipping hotspots around the Atlantic. Commerce raiding, the practice of disrupting the enemy by attacking its merchant shipping, had been hugely successful for Germany during World War I, and World War II was to be no different. One such raider was the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee.
Graf Spee was in the South Atlantic as part of a deliberate campaign. But what they were after was attempting to interrupt, to destroy the global movement of resources to and from the United Kingdom.
The Graf Spee was a jewel in the crown of the German Navy. 12,000 tons with 10 centimeters of armor, massive 280mm guns, and capable of enormous range. Having cruised into the South Atlantic a fortnight before the war began, her captain, Hans Langsdorff, received the authorization to commence raiding on the 26th of September, 1939. Within 4 days, the Graf Spee had her first victim, and over the course of the next several weeks, she, along with her sister ship, the Deutschland, created havoc, sinking over 50,000 tons of Allied shipping, while carefully avoiding engagement with the enemy.
It was his duty not to engage British warships. It was his duty to preserve that ship undamaged and to keep away from any forces that could disable him or destroy him, and thereby interfere with his short-term mission and, in the long term, his survival to be able to be used again.
When news of the attacks reached the Admiralty, 9 squadrons were dispatched to intercept the 2 German ships. The Deutschland prudently chose to return to Germany. However, the Graf Spee, under the command of Hans Langsdorff, remained. Crisscrossing the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, using her range and speed to great effect. But on the 13th of December, she was sighted by the 3-ship squadron of Commodore Henry Harwood off the coast of Uruguay, near the massive estuary, the River Plate.
The River Plate was a focal area where he could expect many merchant ship targets. But as soon as he detected British ships, he should have tried to go in the opposite direction.
Mistaking the light cruisers Ajax and Achilles for less threatening destroyers, Langsdorff decided to engage. It was a costly error. At 6:14, the Graf Spee opened fire. And almost immediately, the Ajax was damaged, along with the heavy cruiser HMS Exeter. Half an hour later, the Exeter, taking water and listing 7 degrees, was struck again. Disabled and with just 1 turret operational, the Exeter delivered a decisive blow. A 208mm shell penetrated the Graf Spee's deck and exploded, destroying her fuel processing system. With only 16 hours of fuel available, and unable to make the complex repairs under fire, Langsdorff made for the neutral port of Montevideo, where, on arrival, and in keeping with his international treaty obligations, he disembarked 61 merchantmen captured at sea. British diplomats demanded the ship leave port, while at the same time, British intelligence led Langsdorff to believe that a powerful fleet, including the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, were on approach. The Germans were helpless, having used all but 20 minutes of their heavy ammunition and having suffered the loss of all their anti-aircraft defenses during the battle. Faced with what he thought to be a superior force, Langsdorff attended the funeral of the men killed at sea and then ordered the Admiral Graf Spee to motor to the middle of Montevideo Harbor, where, at 8:50 p.m. on the 17th of December, just 72 hours after entering port, she was scuttled. 2 days later, believing he had brought dishonor to the Wehrmacht, Langsdorff shot himself.
He scuttled her because he believed that it was inevitable that Graf Spee would be destroyed, that his crew would be lost practically with all hands, and that he would achieve almost no military effect.
The first naval battle of World War II had resulted in an Allied victory. And it was telling, not least because it had taken place off the coast of South America, an early indication that this war would indeed be global, but more because of its impact on the Royal Navy's morale.
I think it had a very important psychological effect for the Royal Navy after many of the failures of the First World War. It was viewed as setting the tone for how the Royal Navy would fight the Second World War, because it confirmed all the attributes for which the Royal Navy had prided itself of initiative, aggression, innovation, going for the enemy. So for that reason, it was extraordinarily important.
Exploring the rise and fall of forgotten civilizations.
We're seeing new things, basically.
Lost Kingdoms of Central America, tonight at 10 on Viasat History. Daring invasions, heroic ambition, and astonishing technological transformations.
For years, this was the capital of the world.
But how did it rise up from uninhabitable marshland to modern metropolis?
You could not have built a Roman city without water transport.
London, 2,000 years of history. Sundays at 10 on Viasat History.
The object is 8.5 inches high.
And about 3 inches thick. It's got a huge propeller stuck on the front.
It's blue.
Whatever it is,
it has long, slender legs.
It has a silk lining.
It shaped our world.
It's got a couple of on-off switches.
And changed our lives.
Because it was designed for one very strange purpose.
Mysteries at the Museum. Weeknights at 9:10 on Viasat History. From its early message of love to countless wars and political gain, how did a religion rooted in peace and humanity become the cause of such conflict?
Religious fundamentalism seems so odd, so alien.
We explore the history of the Christian religion. Christianity and Conflict, weekdays from 11 on Viasat History. These are the stories told by the survivors of the deadliest conflict in history. On the land, at sea, and in the air. A time when the world asked ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Battlefields of World War II, weekdays at 10 on Viasat History.
The period between the fall of Poland in September 1939 and the German invasion of Denmark and Norway in April 1940 was referred to on both sides as the Phony War. Despite Britain and France declaring war on Germany, conflicts such as the Battle of the River Plate were few and at best lackluster. It could easily have been different. Hitler's instinct after Poland's capitulation had been to attack. And on October 6th, he issued his Directive Number 6, which called for just that, a westward offensive against France to be launched on November 12th.
Hitler is very interested in invading very rapidly. It's his generals and the Wehrmacht army that is very reluctant to invade France quickly because, of course, they're thinking of the First World War, and this is likely to take 4 to 5 years to defeat the armies of Britain and France.
The general's success in convincing Hitler to delay action gave Britain, which had been relatively poorly prepared for a continental conflict, valuable time to build capacity for the real war. And on the 9th of April 1940, the real war began, when Hitler's armies, backed by devastating air raids and extensive naval operations, launched attacks on Norway and Denmark.
Germany starts moving towards a plan of attack that aims to knock out France, thereby isolate Britain, knock Britain out of the war through negotiation, and then turn probably to the war that they really want, which is the one in Eastern Europe.
Determined to take control of the Channel ports in order to break the British naval blockade, Hitler's armies were brutally efficient. The Low Countries fell like dominoes under the weight and speed of German aggression. Having suffered massive casualties in frontal attacks during World War I, and convinced that a second war would be a long one that could only be won by a nation focused on defense, the French, along with the British, had planned almost exclusively for a war that would effectively be an updated version of what had occurred in between 1914 and 1918.
France had been bled white by the First World War, and the thinking was, the First World War was the last war that we can envisage. They had a sense that their population and therefore their fighting force was inferior to the Germans, and that's why you get this defensive mentality.
They were slow-moving armies, in many ways weak, undertrained in some senses, and expecting a long period of static war, whereby they would hold the Germans and then gradually build up their fighting strength before defeating them.
To that end, French defenses revolved heavily around the supposedly impregnable Maginot Line, a series of high-tech forts that replaced the crude trenches of World War I and lined the German frontier to the east. Now, with Germany sweeping through the Low Countries and believing they would continue through Belgium, they positioned much of their superior mobile armor, along with the Allies' best troops, to the north along the Belgian border, the site of so much carnage just 25 years before.
And this means that they're in a quandary relatively quickly because they haven't actually planned or prepared for an attack through the Ardennes forest, which is the way the German army actually decides to go.
On the 13th of May, over 1 million highly mobile German troops and 1,500 tanks emerged from the Ardennes near Sedan on the River Meuse. After a 2-day battle, the panzers crossed the river, breaking out of their bridgehead, and under the inspired leadership of General Heinz Guderian, began to race towards the Channel coast, aided by the now utterly dominant Luftwaffe. With the bulk of the Allied forces located in Belgium, there was little to stop the Germans as they sliced across northern France, reaching the English Channel on the 20th of May. With the Allied forces in Belgium now surrounded, France was effectively helpless. On the 14th of June, the first German troops entered Paris. The French humiliation was completed on the 22nd of June, when Hitler insisted the Marshal of France, Philippe Pétain, sign the document of capitulation in the same railway carriage used when Germany had agreed to an armistice in 1918. France had fallen in just 6 weeks.
The defeat of France effectively turns what had been a Western European conflict into a global conflict. The collapse of the French Empire effectively creates a vacuum in East Asia, which encourages Japan to be much more aggressive. Fascist Italy under Mussolini deciding that this is an appropriate moment to get involved. The war won't last much longer and we want to get something out of it.
Now that the Battle of France is lost, said Winston Churchill, there must be a Battle of Britain. In time he would have it. The German blitzkrieg against Western Europe had, within a fortnight, left the British and French and Belgian armies all but defeated. In spite of the desperate situation, London implored the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, Viscount Gort, to attempt to reclaim the strategically important French city of Arras. After a failed attempt to cut through the German spearhead on the 21st of May, Gort and the British, along with the remains of the Belgian and French armies, found themselves trapped in a small area along the coast of northern France and southern Belgium.
So it looks as if the Second World War in the West will be over literally within weeks. What happens, though, is that Lord Gort chooses exactly the right moment to withdraw towards Dunkirk.
Gort made the decision to move his men to the only port from which an Allied withdrawal from Europe remained possible, Dunkirk.
The British army, which is on the beaches of Dunkirk, has to be evacuated if Britain is to remain in the war. So the Royal Navy's task is to launch Operation Dynamo, which is to evacuate not just the British troops, actually, but the French and some of the Belgian troops as well. In order to do that, they need time, and here the Germans give them time.
On the 24th of May, as Guderian was driving toward Dunkirk, he was ordered to pause.
The tank forces in particular were absolutely exhausted from an incredibly rapid 2-week advance across France, and they just couldn't go any farther. Hitler's right-hand man, Hermann Göring, promised Hitler, "We don't need the tanks to do this, we can take care of it with the Air Force," and Hitler believed that.
After discussion with his high command, Hitler endorsed an order to halt.
This gives the British a few vital days in order to organise the small ships and the vessels of the Royal Navy to come to the beaches and to evacuate the troops who were beleaguered there in the perimeter. So in effect, the Germans hand the Allies a few days' grace, and the Royal Navy make the most of that opportunity.
Heavy German bombing had reduced the town of Dunkirk to rubble, and more importantly, decimated the harbour facilities. The evacuation began slowly on May 26th, but gathered pace on the 27th, when Hitler rescinded his orders and the German panzers recommenced their attack. By this time, the Allies had strengthened their defenses, and the tanks were met with heavy resistance. With the harbour almost entirely unusable, the only option was to take the men off the wide sand beaches. But ships of shallow draft were in short supply, and so the Admiralty took the bold step of making the desperate nature of the situation public. Within hours, scores of privately owned vessels began appearing off the beaches of the French coast. For 5 days, a fleet of all shapes and sizes, many with civilian crews, sat calmly offshore under constant air attack, as troops waded out through the shallow water to be ferried back to England. By June the 4th, when the operation ended, 198,000 British and 140,000 French and Belgian troops had been rescued by an estimated 860 small vessels, a flotilla that famously became known as the little ships.
The evacuation of Dunkirk means several things. In sheer practical terms, it means that the British have literally hundreds of thousands of men to continue the fight. Secondly, they've got not just British troops, but French troops especially. So there's a free French army created in Britain because of the evacuation of Dunkirk. And the third thing they've got from it is an enormous psychological boost. I mean, we still talk about the Dunkirk spirit, because although it was a massive defeat, I mean, the British were bundled out of the continent in 3 weeks. It was a psychological victory, which the British drew on for the rest of the war.
The French collapse was as sudden as it was unexpected. The balance of power in Europe had been shifted almost overnight. And as such, a major British fighting force would not return to France until June 1944.
Exploring the rise and fall of forgotten civilizations.
We're seeing new things, basically.
Lost Kingdoms of Central America, tonight at 10 on Viasat History. Daring invasions, heroic ambition, and astonishing technological transformations.
For years, this was the capital of the world.
But how did it rise up from uninhabitable marshland to modern metropolis?
You could not have built a Roman city without water transport.
London, 2,000 years of history. Sundays at 10 on Viasat History.
The object is 8.5 inches high.
And about 3 inches thick. It's got a huge propeller stuck on the front.
It's blue.
Whatever it is,
it has long, slender legs.
It has a silk lining.
It shaped our world.
It's got a couple of on-off switches.
And changed our lives.
Because it was designed for one very strange purpose.
Mysteries at the Museum. Weeknights at 9:10 on Viasat History. From its early message of love to countless wars and political gain, how did a religion rooted in peace and humanity become the cause of such conflict?
Religious fundamentalism seems so odd, so alien.
We explore the history of the Christian religion. Christianity and Conflict, weekdays from 11 on Viasat History. These are the stories told by the survivors of the deadliest conflict in history. On the land, at sea, and in the air. A time when the world asked ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Battlefields of World War II, weekdays at 10 on Viasat History. Lives can take unexpected paths. Paths that can shape destinies.
A whole new world has opened up.
And some destinies shape the world.
This, it is truly wonderful.
The rest is history.
The Allied defeat in France had clearly exposed Britain's lack of military readiness. Great Britain was in peril, and after Dunkirk, Winston Churchill who had replaced Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister, was forced to confront strong factions from within the British Conservative Party, who vigorously petitioned for a negotiated peace agreement with the Reich.
There are even clear signs that Hitler himself is seeking various channels to open up a continuing prospect of that kind of negotiation with Britain. Using the leverage of air attacks against Britain to say, look, this is what it's going to be like, don't take this path.
While Britain continued to maintain the world's largest navy, Hitler knew an amphibious invasion of the British Isles would be possible if Germany could establish control of the air. Less than 2 weeks after Dunkirk, he ordered his generals to prepare Operation Sea Lion, a plan for the invasion of Great Britain, the first stage of which would see a campaign intended to secure German air superiority over southern England, a titanic 12-week struggle that became known as the Battle of Britain. And according to the numbers, the Luftwaffe, with close to 1,300 bombers and dive bombers, 900 single-engined and 300 twin-engine fighters at their disposal, held a clear advantage.
The Battle of Britain initially begins as a highly strategic attack on the part of the Luftwaffe on RAF facilities. Effectively, the argument is, if we take the British Air Force out of the skies, we've achieved what we want. When that becomes less effective or not as quickly effective as the Luftwaffe have hoped, the attention starts shifting towards industry, attacking major factories that are assisting in the production of airplanes and that are underpinning Britain's capacity to stand firm.
Before them stood the British Fighter Command, with just 600 planes. But Britain, despite being heavily outnumbered, had two significant new weapons: radar and the Supermarine Spitfire. Chain Home had been commissioned in 1938 and was, at the time, the only operationally adapted early warning radar system in the world. A series of 21 radar stations situated along the Channel coast. Chain Home, although primitive by today's standards, was able to detect inbound aircraft at 150 miles, crucially giving notice of where and when to direct forces to intercept German bombing raids.
Germany was geared up for rapid, fast, incisive attacks that would knock enemies out of the battle. What the Allies are able to do is to maintain long-term capacity to produce new technology that gradually overwhelms whatever initial superiority the German armed forces had.
After a slow start, the intensive phase of the battle began on the 8th of August. Raids involving up to 1,500 aircraft a day were directed against the British fighter airfields and radar stations. But by late August, the Luftwaffe, its bombers often operating without fighter escort due to the distance from home and largely defenseless against the British fighters, had lost more than 600 aircraft. While the RAF had lost just 260 at the same point, they were rapidly losing experienced pilots, and their effectiveness was being severely hampered by bombing damage done to radar stations and airfields. With the situation appearing grave, Churchill ordered a counterattack, and the RAF launched a series of bombing raids against German industry in early September. An outraged Hitler immediately redirected Luftwaffe attacks from British fighter command installations to London and other cities. With their airfields given temporary respite, the RAF regrouped, and the battle shifted into a different phase. A miraculously revitalized RAF, bolstered by pilots from France and Belgium, began shooting down German bombers faster than they could be built. With losses beyond all calculation and no clear victory in sight, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion until further notice, and on the 17th of September, the Battle of Britain came to an end.
Battle of Britain proves that if you don't have command of the skies, you will not win this war. It means that Hitler initially postpones, but then completely abandons any plan to invade Britain and has to accept the fact that Britain will be an antagonist, a belligerent power for the rest of the war. So any idea in early 1940 that Britain could be kind of bargained out of involvement in the Second World War, by September 1940, it's gone.
And with that British victory and island sovereignty came lasting repercussions. The Allies had retained a base of operations on Germany's doorstep from which they could go on the offensive in Europe. 12 weeks of airborne combat that will forever be remembered as a defining moment of the Second World War. But they weren't the only players looking to move to the offensive. Mussolini had watched on as his military hero Adolf Hitler battled through Western Europe. The time had come, he thought, to maintain parity with Germany and build the great Mediterranean empire he had promised the Italian people. Having easily occupied a weak and virtually unarmed Albania in 1939, his sights turned to neighboring Greece. Imagining himself something of a Julius Caesar, Il Duce set about proving himself more an impulsive buffoon.
Italy's invasion of Greece was poorly thought through.
What they didn't expect was stout resistance from the Greeks. They expected to walk through Greece. But what happened was the Greeks were motivated to repel the invader. And not only did they stop the Italian invasion at the Albanian border, but they drove the Italian forces deep into Albanian territory.
It was October 28, 1940, and a stunned Hitler was in Spain when he first learned of the Italian attacks. His blueprint for a massive invasion of the Soviet Union in the spring of 1941 relied on peace in the Balkans.
What is the importance of the Eastern Mediterranean? It's oil, it's the Suez Canal, it's control over that soft underbelly of Europe.
Now, in a single stroke and without warning, Mussolini had destabilized Germany's entire southern flank.
Hitler had no interest in expanding a German empire into the Mediterranean, but he had no choice but to intervene in Mediterranean affairs once its Italian ally got into dire trouble in the Balkans.
Hitler resisted immediate unplanned intervention and instead watched on as what he described as a pig's breakfast unfolded over 3 long months. With Mussolini's army, poorly equipped and poorly managed, suffering embarrassment after embarrassment. Then the worst winter in 2 decades struck, creating a scene that appeared like a macabre replay of World War I. Men shivering together in trenches carved out of ice and frozen mud, resulting in thousands receiving amputations due to frostbite. By late February 1941, Greece, which prior to the invasion had been neutral, was pleading with Britain to provide reinforcements, and they obliged.
Once Italy drew Greece into the war, that drew the British into Greece. Once the British were in Greece, then Germany's vital interests in the south were in jeopardy. Therefore, they had to now counter the British threat in the Balkans.
And counter it he did, in devastating fashion. On Sunday, April 6th, 600,000 German troops and 2,000 tanks launched a blitzkrieg-type assault, entering Greece through neighboring Bulgaria. Within 3 days, the 2nd Panzer Division rolled into Greece's second-largest city and port, Salonika, crashing through the Greek defenses and surrounding 70,000 Greek soldiers who were forced to surrender. A small Allied force of 60,000 comprising mostly Australians and New Zealanders, stood with what remained of the Greek army against overwhelming odds.
The Allied response to the Axis and its strategy was to try to defend certain points along the route to Athens. And interestingly, they tried to defend certain passes which were defended during the Persian Wars in ancient times, like Tempe and Thermopylae, but none of it worked. They were constantly on the back foot.
The speed and ruthlessness of the German advance mirrored that of the invasion of France, and within just 3 weeks of crossing the Greek border, the Germans were flying the swastika over the Acropolis. Hitler's only instruction to Mussolini once he had acted was effectively a call to stay out of the way.
And really, the turning point of Italy's war was that moment. From thereafter, Italy became a dependency of Germany.
Exploring the rise and fall of forgotten civilizations.
We're seeing new things, basically.
Lost Kingdoms of Central America, tonight at 10 on Viasat History. Daring invasions, heroic ambition, and astonishing technological transformations.
For years, this was the capital of the world.
But how did it rise up from uninhabitable marshland to modern metropolis?
You could not have built a Roman city without water transport.
London, 2,000 years of history. Sundays at 10 on Viasat History.
The object is 8.5 inches high.
And about 3 inches thick. It's got a huge propeller stuck on the front.
It's blue.
Whatever it is,
it has long, slender legs.
It has a silk lining.
It shaped our world.
It's got a couple of on-off switches.
And changed our lives.
Because it was designed for one very strange purpose.
Mysteries at the Museum. Weeknights at 9:10 on Viasat History. From its early message of love to countless wars and political gain, how did a religion rooted in peace and humanity become the cause of such conflict?
Religious fundamentalism seems so odd, so alien.
We explore the history of the Christian religion. Christianity and Conflict, weekdays from 11 on Viasat History. These are the stories told by the survivors of the deadliest conflict in history. On the land, at sea, and in the air. A time when the world asked ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Battlefields of World War II, weekdays at 10 on Viasat History.
In September 1940, 5 Italian divisions began a rapid advance into Egypt that was brought to a grinding halt in front of the main British defenses at Mersa Matruh. Despite being severely outnumbered, the British launched a withering counteroffensive 6 weeks later. And by February 1941, they had seized virtually all Italian territory along the North African coastline, including the strategically important Libyan port of Tobruk.
By possessing Tobruk, it meant that you freed yourself up from having to transport its supplies, its ammunition, its fuel. So it really lessened the reliance upon the roads as a means of conveying logistics.
With Britain agreeing to support Greece, much of their North African force was reassigned. leaving Libya garrisoned by an under-equipped and inexperienced 9th Australian Division, joined by a similarly under-equipped remnant of the British Army's 2nd Armoured Division. Hitler, dismayed by the defeats being suffered by the Italians, quickly dispatched one of his most enterprising generals, Erwin Rommel, along with the recently formed Africa Corps, to stabilize the situation. Operating out of Tripoli, Rommel wasted little time. On the 24th of March, he attacked. And, in what can only be described as a rout, he had completely overwhelmed the British forces within a week and proceeded to drive them across Libya toward the sea, and tellingly, the ancient city of Tobruk. When the Allies fell back to the city in early April, they quickly began to build on what already existed.
This single line of defences was all that was there, but progressively, first line of defences was then backed up by subsequent positions of defence in depth, so that if there was a breakthrough in the outer perimeter, that there was another line of defence to stop it.
Tobruk was attacked by German and Italian forces on the 13th of April. Rommel followed the tried and tested method of sending his tanks in first to create a gap through which the infantry would follow. The tanks met little resistance, but as soon as the infantry advanced, they came under fierce attack. The Allies had made a strategic decision to let the tanks through and attack only once they were trapped inside the defensive line. Rommel was forced to withdraw with significant losses, but attacked again on the 15th of April with similar results. And so the siege began. A siege that would last for 9 months and place a huge burden on Rommel's already overstretched resources.
Rommel is fighting on two fronts. He wants the fortress, he wants the harbour, more importantly than the fortress itself. And it's a great thorn in his side because he also has to look at and check the British who are fighting on their frontier. So from Rommel's point of view, the bulk of his forces are deployed on that Libyan-Egyptian frontier, trying to keep the British Army at bay, while he's also trying to build up his own forces and concentrate and try to capture Tobruk.
Tobruk provided a huge boost to British morale after the devastation that was Western Europe. For the first time in the war, the all-conquering German panzer units had been stopped.
Now, we can't say that if Tobruk had not been held, that Rommel would have rampaged right through Egypt, got the Suez Canal and got the oil of the Middle East. But by holding Tobruk, they prevented Rommel from potentially advancing further into Egypt and bought time for them to build up reinforcements and develop defences to then take back the territory that Rommel had captured.
The Allies would eventually succeed in doing just that, as Hitler's attention turned to a far greater conflict in the East. In Hitler's mind, communism and Judaism were linked together as the same evil force that was threatening Germany. And despite having signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviets in 1939, it was never a question of if he would attack Russia. It was simply a question of when. That when arrived on the 22nd of June, 1941, when the German army launched the largest armed invasion in history, Operation Barbarossa.
There are many fronts that they're fighting on. The Eastern Front is the war Germany fights. From the 22nd of June 1941, there is never less than 75% of the German army employed anywhere but fighting in the East. If we look at the ideological side of it, this is where we see a very pure Nazi doctrine. There is no restraint in this war.
The Germans are very commonly thinking in terms of 30 or 40 million people in the Soviet Union dying in the first year alone of German occupation. So the invasion plan, as they start to develop it, becomes this plan for the most absolutely unthinkably massive genocidal campaign in human history.
Barbarossa set the German forces into 3 distinct fighting groups, each led by panzer divisions. Army Group North would attack from the northwest toward Leningrad, Army Group Center toward Moscow, and Army Group South would move through the Balkans. The objective of the panzers was to break through the Soviet border where the vast majority of the Red Army was stationed, enact large-scale blitzkrieg pincer movements, encircle the Soviet armies, and then crush the surrounded troops, leaving Russia defenseless. Supporting the tanks along a 2,900-kilometer front would be in excess of 3 million infantry. And at first, it was a stunning success. Within a week, they had taken Riga in Latvia. A week later, they forced the surrender of 290,000 Red Army troops and 2,500 tanks at Białystok in northern Poland. But the Russians withdrew, and the Germans were drawn east over ever-increasing distances inside the Soviet Union. And while the Red Army, bereft of effective leadership as a result of Stalin's purges, continued to fall, the extreme conditions saw the Germans begin to experience losses amongst their operational elite, the units upon which so much of their blitzkrieg-style tactics depended, their tanks. Fine sands and poor roads, combined with a shortage of replacement engines and spare parts, had taken their toll on the German tanks, and with it came a reduction in their operational capacity.
Hitler had sincerely hoped that he would be able to destroy the Red Army extremely quickly. When the Soviet Union did not collapse, suddenly Hitler's lightning war, his quick war plan, fell into disarray.
At this point, Hitler fell into a dispute with his generals, who wanted to push on to the Russian capital, Moscow. Hitler overruled them and directed the main German force toward Kiev. And while the shock of the attack had almost unhinged the Soviet state, and German forces had destroyed most of the Red Army and the Russian Air Force, without their panzers at full strength, they had failed to deliver the crucial blow needed to break Soviet resistance.
In some ways, I think a helpful analogy to conceive of all of this is a spear. If you imagine the spear tip has been cut off, there is still a spear, and the shaft is still very much there with the bulk of the power in it. But it doesn't function as a spear anymore. This is a real problem the Germans have. They are losing their operational edge, and they can't get it back.
By early October, it became clear that Operation Barbarossa, in so many ways an audacious success, could not deliver the speedy victory the Germans had hoped for. And as Hitler redirected his army towards Moscow, the very reason for that haste, the Russian winter, began to bare its teeth. It was the overwhelming success of the high-risk blitzkrieg approach in France during May 1940 that led Germany to gamble even more heavily on the invasion of Russia. But that strategy had failed, and as they approached Moscow in October 1941, they found themselves staring at the possibility of something all too familiar, a war of attrition.
Now, the front line in October 1941 is about 300 kilometers from Moscow. And as they pull together these three new armored groups, the objective is to punch through the Soviet lines, to enact new encirclements, to destroy the Soviet forces, and then once again to drive on to Moscow. Now, if that didn't work in Operation Barbarossa, one might say it's probably not going to work here either, especially since we're launching this in October. That's very different from launching it in the height of summer.
To beat the weather and avoid a prolonged campaign, the Germans launched Operation Typhoon, a last throw of the dice, a ruthless drive to Moscow that again began with stunning success. Crashing through the Russian lines at the Battle of Vyazma, the Germans enacted an encirclement that resulted in some 550,000 Soviets falling into captivity. At the same time, in the south, another decisive victory at the Battle of Bryansk saw a further 100,000 Soviets captured. In just 10 days, over 1 million Russians were removed from the order of battle. 650,000 as prisoners, the rest either killed, wounded, or lost in the fighting. But as October moved to November, the weather rapidly deteriorated, Heavy rain turned the battlefield into a quagmire, and the German army, so close to total victory, was forced to halt and consider their position. And it didn't look promising.
The Wehrmacht, by the end of 1941, was in a very desperate state. They'd been fighting in an enormously costly and heavy campaign despite their successes since the 22nd of June. When they launched their invasion, they had a superiority in numbers over the Soviets of 1.4 to 1. By the time they reached Moscow, the Soviets outnumbered them 1.2 to 1.
On the 15th of November 1941, the wet ground froze sufficiently to allow the German tanks to move. Despite having just a third of their motor vehicles functioning, their infantry divisions at just a third to half strength, and with serious logistical issues preventing the delivery of winter equipment to the front, they attacked again. However, the Red Army had used the time well. Moscow was now protected by a triple defensive ring. But perhaps the biggest enemy the Germans faced was a Russian winter that would be the coldest of the 20th century. Vehicles had to be heated for hours before they could be effectively used, and German soldiers began to perish in frightening numbers as the temperature plunged below -40 degrees. By early December, despite having Moscow in plain view, the German push came to an end.
On the 5th of December 1941, the German offensive, Operation Typhoon, is finally called to a halt. German forces are overextended, they are exhausted, they are at the end of very tenuous supply lines, and they have absolutely no idea of what's coming. The offensive from the Soviets will begin on the evening of the 5th, but it will begin in earnest in the next few days as more and more forces reach the front. And the Germans will then begin a massive withdrawal, both in the north of Moscow and towards the south around Tula.
A withdrawal that would prove to be catastrophic. The German army had already suffered appalling losses. With over 25% of the initial invasion force either killed or wounded, the final toll would be over 35,757 killed in action, 128,716 wounded, and thousands unaccounted for. Committed to a global war and fighting in Northern Africa and the Atlantic, Hitler's largely ideological war in Eastern Europe, his desperate desire to rid the earth of communism and the Slavic people, had failed. And that failure would have lasting repercussions.
It's an economic war by this point, and it's a material-rich war, and they're trying to shift as many more forces to the Eastern Front. They don't have enough to replace their losses, and they never ever will. The implications of the failure of 1941 will roll on into every other operation throughout the rest of the war, and it is unambiguously the turning point.
And with Europe in disarray, the rest of the world would explode into total war.
Exploring the rise and fall of forgotten civilizations.
We're seeing new things, basically.
Lost Kingdoms of Central America, tonight at 10 on Viasat History. Daring invasions, heroic ambition, and astonishing technological transformations.
For years, this was the capital of the world.
But how did it rise up from uninhabitable marshland to modern metropolis?
You could not have built a Roman city without water transport.
London, 2,000 years of history. Sundays at 10 on Viasat History.
The object is 8.5 inches high.
And about 3 inches thick. It's got a huge propeller stuck on the front.
It's blue.
Whatever it is,
it has long, slender legs.
It has a silk lining.
It shaped our world.
It's got a couple of on-off switches.
And changed our lives.
Because it was designed for one very strange purpose.
Mysteries at the Museum. Weeknights at 9:10 on Viasat History. From its early message of love to countless wars and political gain, how did a religion rooted in peace and humanity become the cause of such conflict?
Religious fundamentalism seems so odd, so alien.
We explore the history of the Christian religion. Christianity and Conflict, weekdays from 11 on Viasat History. These are the stories told by the survivors of the deadliest conflict in history. On the land, at sea, and in the air. A time when the world asked ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Battlefields of World War II, weekdays at 10 on Viasat History.
20, 49, 58, 59, 20, 50. 10 секунд, разбой идет.
There's a tornado right there. Guys, everybody go. The wind started howling and you could hear the roar coming.
Looks like a 5,000-pound bomb hit the middle of town and blew up.
Holy get it done! Oh my God!
This is an emergency. You go to a safe place right now.
I knew the direction it was heading, and I knew my baby was in that path.
Oh my God!
As temperatures rise all around the globe, natural disasters are becoming more violent and more frequent. Extreme weather survivors have captured the intensity and the magnitude of these events. These are first-hand accounts of a planet gone rogue. April 27th, 2011 was the worst day on record in Alabama. 62 tornadoes touched ground and 252 people died in less than 24 hours. James Spann spent most of that day on live TV, trying to save lives.
Get away from the door!
The most important part of my job is to provide adequate warning for storms that can kill people. And if we're not successful at that, we're not successful at anything.
At 5:40 a.m., James Spann joins his colleague, Jason Simpson, who's been on the air since 3:30 a.m.
I want to show you this from the graphic system. The Storm Prediction Center has placed Alabama in a high risk of severe weather today.
We all knew it was going to be bad. It's going to be one of the worst severe weather days that we'd ever seen.
We've got James Spann.
Thank you very much. When he walked in the door, for me, there was a feeling of comfort because I knew I wasn't going to keep fighting this fire alone.
In addition to radar and satellite data, Spann and Simpson rely on professional storm spotters to provide what they call ground truth.
We were one of several teams that worked for James Spann at his TV station. So our job is to find storms in northwest Alabama, and when they start happening, to give visual confirmation.
45 years in the weather business, and I've never seen a tornado, and somehow or other, I just had this knowledge that I was going to see one on this day.
Brian and Tim meet in the city of Jasper, an hour northwest of Birmingham, where Spann's TV station is located.
Around 2 p.m., we notice an odd-looking cloud approaching us.
Brian, is that a rain-free base over there, sir?
I was just trying to decide that.
I mean, this storm looks so weak on radar, it doesn't even seem possible.
doesn't look like much at all. Lo and behold, it comes over us, and as it comes over us, we see that telltale sign, a rain-free base and a wall cloud, and in addition to that, the wall cloud is rotating.
I see rotation. I see rotation. Check it out, Brian. Yep. Rotation. We have rotation.